This story happened a few months ago, and it still gives me chills to this day. I had decided to go on a solo camping trip through the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail is this long hiking trail through the woods and past several mountainous regions. It spans over 2,000 miles and passes through 14 states in the US. I am an experienced camper. I have camped out in the forests of the Appalachian Trails before, and nothing bad has ever happened to me. I don't usually encounter too many people on the secluded parts of the trail, but the people I met during my previous camping experiences were always nice and friendly to me. Anyways, my hike was supposed to last 3 days. I planned to hike the trails through the forest during the day and veer off the trail at night to set up camp. Spending time in nature was one of my favorite things to do. Hearing birds chirping off in the distance, having the sun beaming down on my face, basking in the peace and quiet, everything about the outdoors excited me. On my first day of hiking, everything started out according to plan. I packed my bag full of supplies, all the essential stuff, food, water, tent, you get the idea. And I also brought a hunting knife with me, just for protection. After all, being alone in the woods with no method of defense is a death sentence. As I walked through the woods, everything was perfect. That was, until I heard a crunch of a twig a little ways off in the distance. It was mid-afternoon, so I knew that it was probably just another hiker who was out hiking the trail like me. I turned around, but I saw no one. I kept walking, thinking nothing of it. Half an hour later, I heard it again. A twig snapping beneath someone's feet, followed by the rustling of leaves. I turned again to look at the trail behind me, but there was no one. That's when I realized that the sound had to be originating from the forest. The rustling of bushes sounded again, this time louder, closer. Someone was out there. I thought it was just another hiker, but then why the hell were they hanging out in the woods and not on the trail? Were they setting up camp somewhere in the forest? No, it was still way too early for that. I scanned the forest. The afternoon daylight provided me with a good amount of light, but the thick canopy of trees still shrouded the entire area in shadows. Then I saw it. Standing behind a thick tree was a dark silhouette of a person. They were too far away to see clearly, but I could just make out one of their legs poking out from behind the thick bark of the tree and half of a face peeking around it. Someone was watching me. I froze. I called out to the figure. "Hey," I shouted, "who the hell are you?" At the sound of my voice, the person behind the tree turned and sprinted away further into the woods. Whoever they were must have panicked when I saw them. That whole experience shook me up, but I still decided to carry on with my walk. Maybe it was just some hiker playing a stupid prank. I tried not to think the worst, but I had no idea how bad things would get later on. I continued walking for a few more hours, until the light faded so much that it was getting difficult to see the path in front of me. Night was falling fast, and I knew that it was time to set up camp. I continued up the trail just a little longer, then turned into the tree line and headed into the woods, looking for a clearing. After about 5 minutes of walking into the woods, avoiding stumbling into the base of large trees or being poked by sharp branches, I reached a clearing. It was small, but it was still big enough to prop up my tent. So that's what I did. It took some time, but eventually, I was able to set up my tent. By the time I had finished, it was completely dark out. I had no time to light a fire, so I just ate some rations I had packed in my bag. I would catch some fish tomorrow and roast them over a fire. After eating, I got my sleeping bag, placed it in my tent, crawled inside, and zipped up the tent. Feeling tired, I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. I awoke from my sleep what must have been a few hours later to a sound outside my tent. I was groggy, so I could barely make out what it was, but soon it became crystal clear. Footsteps. There were footsteps outside my tent. Someone was walking around it. I could feel my heart beating faster, and my mind instantly jumped back to the person I saw lurking in the tree line earlier that afternoon. Could it be them? Had they been following me for hours through the woods without my knowledge? I instinctively twisted over in my sleeping bag and reached for my hunting knife, trying to make as little noise as possible. I was petrified, my body feeling stiff, my mind racing. Then, the person outside my tent started to laugh. At first, it was just a soft giggle, but then the laugh grew louder, eventually becoming a maniacal cackle. It was as if this person knew I was awake and was trying to scare me. The footsteps grew louder and started to develop a sadistic rhythm, as if the person was dancing circles around my tent, cackling at the top of their lungs. I didn't dare unzip my tent and peek outside. The laughing and dancing footsteps soon also started to be accompanied by a thumping sound, as if someone was banging their fists and drumming their knuckles against some object. I was terrified. After what felt like an eternity, the laughing stopped, and I could hear footsteps retreating back into the tree line. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The person could still be around. My plan was to stay here in the tent for the rest of the night and leave at the first crack of dawn. So that's what I did. I laid there for the rest of the night, eyes wide, my hunting knife clutched in my hand so tightly my knuckles were white. At the first sign of light outside my tent, I sprang into action. I unzipped my tent slowly and carefully, hunting knife still clutched in my hand, ready to attack the person if they were out there waiting for me. But there was no one. Instead, outside my tent, I found a single note, an old, dirty-looking paper neatly folded and placed at the front of my tent. On the note read 5 simple words: "Get out of my woods." Around the area I found the note were several large pools of what I was sure was blood. I checked around my tent where the person had circled around it and found several drops of blood all around the tent as well. I packed up my tent at lightning speed and practically sprinted out of the woods and back onto the trail. Instead of continuing in the direction I was headed, I turned around and headed in the direction I came from. My original plan was to hike for 3 days until I reached a small town, where my brother would pick me up. Instead, I turned back and headed for the car I had parked down the trail in a parking lot. It would take me a full day to reach there, so I walked fast. My phone, of course, had no service. I walked at a brisk pace for hours, only stopping for a few minutes in random intervals to rest. I wanted to get out of those woods as fast as possible. I now realized why the person hadn't attacked me last night. They didn't want to kill me, they were trying to scare me and send me a warning. If I didn't get out of these woods fast, I would be dead. And what those drops of blood had come from, I had no idea. But there was no way I was sticking around to find out. That's when I heard the sound again. A twig snapping in the distance, leaves crunching beneath someone's feet, bushes rustling off somewhere close to the tree line. I turned and scanned the woods, and this time there was no mistaking it. A tall, skinny man, standing in the woods, smiling. It was clear that this person was the same person I saw yesterday afternoon, and the same person who terrorized me last night. This man had been following me for God knows why. I just stood there, staring at him. He stood as frozen as a statue, and although the midday sun illuminated the area well, he was under the shadow of a large tree branch, making his appearance even more ghostly. He smiled wide, revealing rows of sharp white teeth. His eyes were wild and bulging. I don't think I ever saw him blink. But his face wasn't even the worst part. He was wearing tattered clothes that were torn in several places, but they were covered in red stains, blood. And in his hand, he held a machete, also with those same red stains. This man, who had been stalking me in the woods, was covered in blood, and now he was staring at me. Then, without warning, the man dropped onto all fours like some sort of freaky wild animal and started charging directly towards me, cackling that same devilish laugh I heard the night before. I fell out of my trance and I started to run, adrenaline coursing through my body. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. All the while, I could hear the man laughing. I turned around, and the man was now out of the woods and on the trail, now running on 2 feet. His footsteps sounded hard on the dirt path. He was gaining on me. I just kept running, but when it became clear he was going to catch me, a plan formulated in my mind. I stopped dead in my tracks and the man ran into me, his weight almost tackling me to the ground. He tried to slice me with his machete, but I was faster and stronger. I pulled my hunting knife from my pocket and plunged it into the man's stomach. He screamed, and that was just the distraction I needed. I pushed him off me and he fell to the floor. I continued to run, booking it down the trail. I don't know how I made it out of those woods that night, but I did. The next thing I remember was leaping into my car and bursting into tears as I drove away from that damn trail and back home. I went to the police the next day and reported the incident, but they never found the man. What they did find, however, was a body. It wasn't far from my campsite. It was a man, probably around the same age as me, a fellow hiker, and his body was covered in stab wounds, and his head was missing. And that's when I came to a horrifying realization, one that has kept me up every night since the incident, playing over in my head ever since. That night, while I was in the tent, that man was walking around my tent, dancing and laughing, holding the head of a victim he had murdered not too far from where I slept. That's why there were bloodstains everywhere. The bloody head was dripping onto the ground outside of my tent. The thumping sounds I heard was the man thumping his fist against the head like it was some sort of crude drum. That was the last time I ever set foot on the Appalachian Trail. Although I feel much better now, that man has never been caught, and I will never get the image out of my head of a crazy man walking around my tent at night holding a severed head of someone he had just killed. I thank God that he spared me that night, and I am thankful that I was able to get away from him when he tried to kill me that following day. Be careful out there. You never know what kind of creeps you will encounter in the great outdoors.